The image of the cave is perhaps the most famous passage from the entire Platonic corpus, and it's one of the most interesting, suggestive, and influential passages in the entire history of philosophy. What we have covered so far with the image of the sun and the divided line, both of those images prepare the ground or set a foundation for the image of the cave. And so now we're going to try to see what's going on in this image of the cave. And we're going to make use at kind of later on of the image of the sun and the divided line. We're going to see how exactly they play into this image of the cave. First thing I want to mention before jumping into the details here, the image of the cave is an image, or it's supposed to illustrate something about how we stand with regard to education. The image of the cave is fundamentally about education. I'd mentioned this earlier when I was trying to tie the Gorgias to the Republic, because if you recall in the Gorgias, uh, Socrates claims that happiness is determined entirely by education and virtue, or more particularly education and justice. And the Gorgias doesn't really do much at all with that claim about education, doesn't say much about it. And so here in the image of the cave, we're going to finally see exactly what Plato's thoughts are. And this is also going to help us see what Plato sees as the value of philosophy. That's also what we're going to see when in this image of the cave. Okay. So Plato or Socrates asks us to imagine a bunch of prisoners down at the bottom of a cave. And they are all chained. Their legs and their heads are shackled, I think he says. And so they can't move. They can't turn their heads. They have to just look straight forward at the wall of the cave, right? And he says something like, well, there's a wall behind them, and far behind them is a fire. So there's a fire in this cave, and then behind the wall, that's kind of immediately behind them, there are statues and artifacts, he says, that are kind of popping up above the wall, and so are casting shadows on the wall of the cave. And these artifacts, these statues, move back and forth. There is a succession of them. So I'm just using, and I'm going to use this example throughout my description of the image of the cave. I'm using a tree as an example, but Plato himself doesn't use an example. He kind of hints at one later on, and we'll talk about it later. But part of what makes reading the cave a little bit difficult is that he doesn't use an illustration or example. I'm going to use a tree. And so there are these, but not, there are all kinds of things being walked back and forth. And these prisoners are staring at these shadows on the wall. And they've been there their whole life. And so all they know are these shadows on the wall. Those prisoners take the shadows on the wall to be the entirety of reality. That's all there is to reality. That's the fullest truth of things. Now, let me emphasize at this point, the tree that's being dragged or walked back and forth there is not even a real tree, Plato emphasizes. It's an artifact. It's like a fake tree, a prop tree, a plastic tree, something like that. And so these prisoners, what they think of as the reality about trees is in fact simply a shadow of an artificial tree. It's not even the shadow of a real tree, it's the shadow of an artificial tree. They take this to be the entire truth about trees. Yeah, something like that is Plato's claim. And then Glaucon says, well, these are very bizarre prisoners you have here. And Socrates says, maybe, but those prisoners, that's you and me. That's us. That's the run of humanity. The vast majority of people are like this. This is their state of education, right? And so what we have so far is a depiction of how most people stand when it comes to education. And what you might say, obviously, is that they don't stand very well. Their state of education, they take shadows of artificial things to be the truth about things. But what Plato is trying to depict here in this image is that they're about as far from the truth as you could possibly get. Yeah, something like that. Okay. Next kind of phase of the story. Plato asks us to imagine now, or what he introduces in the story, there's some kind of mysterious figure who somehow, for some reason, Plato suggests it might be by kind of just divine chance, divine luck, some figure appears. And this figure can break people's chains and free them. And so proceeds to do that, right? And now we have one prisoner, say now, who's been freed, whose chains have been broken. Yeah. And now let's say this person who broke this prisoner's chains turns the prisoner around, the now free prisoner around, and shows him the truth, shows him what's actually going on, right? You were just looking at these shadows, but those shadows aren't the reality of things. Look, that shadow is being cast by this plastic tree over here, and there's this fire, and it's casting these, and so on, right? This is how things are going. What Socrates mentions here is that the prisoner, when he first turns, is not going to be able to look at these things. It's going to hurt his eyes, right? When your eyes are adjusted to darkness and then they have to look at something that's comparably much brighter, right? You have to squint. You can't really look. It hurts your eyes. Yeah. It's going to be painful. This idea of going from darkness to light, or as we're going to see later, lightness to dark, and the fact that your eyes have to adjust, that it's kind of painful. This is woven into the image. This is something that Plato is working with in this image. It's painful. And so the prisoner is actually not going to want to do it. They're not going to want to look at those things. They're going to prefer to simply stay put. Sit back down and look at the shadows on the wall of the cave. And part of what Plato is indicating here is that it's painful to have your, this is one way we might think about it. It's painful to have your world turned upside down, so to speak, to have your beliefs shown to you to be false. That's a painful thing to go through. That's why the prisoner doesn't like it. That's why the prisoner just wants to sit down. They don't want to acknowledge the truth. They don't want to acknowledge that everything that before that they thought was true is in fact false, that they were just looking at these shadows of things. That's a painful ordeal to go through. And so that's why this freed prisoner is going to prefer just to sit back down and look at these shadows. It's easier that way. It's less painful. I don't have to admit I was wrong. Yeah. But now we're going to kind of zoom out because we're going to tell more of the story. The entire story doesn't take place at the bottom of this cave. So let's kind of zoom out now. So down at the bottom there, you can see the angry prisoner who's been freed and this hooded figure who has freed him. Now we're going to imagine that this hooded figure doesn't let this freed prisoner just go back and sit down. This hooded figure picks that guy back up and pushes him not just to stare at these plastic trees or these fake things, but pushes him out of the cave. And Plato describes this journey out of the cave as being extraordinarily difficult. It's a rough, steep path. It's not easy. And so that's why this freed prisoner is going to need some sort of push, some sort of guidance, some sort of force. The language of force is kind of all over the place here. It's what Plato is using. This person has to be forced out of the cave, forced up and out on this rough, steep path. But now we're to imagine them out of the cave. And here they come. Well, they're really not going to be able to see things, right? They were just in a cave their whole life. Their eyes are going to take some time to adjust. It's going to be too bright for them outside, at least at first. And so Plato says at first, they're not really going to be able to look at things. At first, all they'll be able to do is look at the shadows of things. And so our freed prisoner at first can simply, Plato also mentions kind of reflections. If there were a pond or whatever, and the tree were casting a reflection in the pond, the prisoner could look at that, or this freed prisoner could look at that. But his eyes haven't adjusted enough yet, and so can't look at the actual things themselves. And so just these shadows or reflections, images, if you will. But eventually their eyes will adjust and they'll be able to look at the things themselves, the things themselves, right? And so the prisoner or the freed prisoner can now look at the actual live tree, real tree itself. Yeah. Not just the shadow, but their eyes have adjusted enough. Now they can look at the real tree or whatever, other real objects, yeah? And eventually, Plato says, their eyes will adjust to such a degree that they will be able to look at the sun itself. Yeah. And that's the culmination of their journey. Looking at the sun itself, right? Their eyes will have adjusted to such a degree that they'll be able to look at the sun itself. Okay. So the image of the cave is this story of ascent. It's a story of ascent from what's least true, namely those shadows cast by artificial things on the wall of the cave, an ascent from what is least true to what is most true, right? And you can see that simply in terms of the various trees that are there. There's the shadow of the plastic tree. There's the plastic tree. There's the shadow of the real tree, and then the real tree. What Plato says now is that this whole image, what he says is that the divided line, which we talked about earlier, can be mapped on to this image. Right? And so there's the divided line to remind you. And there were 4 sections on the divided line. Well, look, there are 4 trees there in this image of the cave. And so that first section of the divided line is represented by the shadows of the fake trees, the shadows on the wall of the cave. That corresponds to the imaging portion of the divided line. Looking at the plastic trees, the fake trees, that corresponds to the second section of the divided line. Looking at the shadows of real trees corresponds to the third section. And looking at the real tree itself corresponds to the 4th section of the divided line, right? Looking at the real tree itself, that's the 4th section of the divided line. But also looking at the sun, that's also going to be part of the fourth section of divided line. Because, and here's where the other image, the image of the sun, comes in. The sun represents the form of the good. And the form of the good is a form. And it's something that we can come to understand. And so the culmination of our journey is understanding the form of the good. Understanding the form of tree, the essence of treeness, that's understanding. That's communicating with forms. That's the fourth section of the divided line. But even kind of that's not even the culmination yet of the journey. The culmination of the journey is going to be understanding the form of the good. If you recall, in the image of the sun, the form of the good is what's responsible for there even being forms at all. In some sense, it has the most truth. It's the truest thing. Yeah. And so all of the things that we said about the divided line kind of apply here to the image of the cave. The greatest truth is to be found in looking at the things that themselves outside of the cave. That's like looking at the forms. That stands for understanding the forms or natures or essences of things. And that third section of the divided line, when we'd gone over it, I said, don't worry about it so much. We're not going to worry about it. I'm not going to ask you any questions really about it. One thing you should know about it, though, is that it's kind of like looking at images of forms, right? It's or something like that. Well, now you can see why I said that. Because the third section of the divided line corresponds to looking at these shadows or reflections or images of the real things outside the cave. Those real things are forms or stand for forms. And so these objects of thought are in some way or another going to be reflections of forms, images of forms, something like that, right? That's the idea. And they contain less truth than the forms themselves do. And then so on for the other sections of the divided line, right? One thing I'll point out that can be kind of tricky, that section of the divided line, if you recall, when Plato was describing the divided line, you are in that second section of the divided line when you look out your window and you see a tree or whatever. Here in the cave, Plato is saying that kind of cognitive awareness, when you look out your window and see a tree, that's not the fullest truth about things. That's like looking at imitations of things. And what you're really looking at is a kind of imitation of the form of tree, an image of the form of tree, a plastic tree, right? And so there's something kind of, call it fake, I suppose, but about the sensible world. That's what the image of the cave is kind of incorporating into it, right? This world that we're in touch with with our senses, it's in some sense just composed of images of the full truth of things. The things that we can find with our senses are really just things that point us towards the forms themselves. And what Plato is picking up on here is this idea that sensible things participate in forms. They are images in some sense of the forms. And so these prisoners down at the bottom of the cave, who are us, right? They are at the farthest remove from truth. But they think what they see is the entire truth about things, right? And what Plato is saying is that how do we stand with regard to education? We're like those prisoners. We think the least true things are the entire truth. Now, the let me now introduce Plato's image, Plato's example or illustration. It's not a full illustration. Plato doesn't talk about trees. I've just been using that to kind of explain what's going on here, to give us an illustration of what's going on here. The only example that Plato mentions, and this is it's kind of tangential, he doesn't explain it in much detail. He doesn't mention trees, rather he mentions justice. So he would say, instead of trees, a shadow of a fake tree and then the shadow of a real tree and then a real tree, he would say something like justice should take the place of tree. Now, it'd be very hard to illustrate that in a way that, right? And so that's why I've chosen something like tree, make it a little bit easier. But justice would be one of his examples. And so the idea then would be, all of us who are prisoners chained up at the bottom of the cave, we see these shadows of justice, but not even real justice, something like fake justice, shadows of fake justice, right? We are at the farthest remove from the truth about justice. And yet we take it to be the entire truth about justice. These kind of very distant imitations or shadows or images of justice, we take to be the entire truth about justice. But it's not. They're not. The full truth about justice would be understanding the form of justice, the essence, the nature of justice. Yeah. Now, let's return back into the cave, because the story doesn't end here. One of the most famous aspects of this image of the cave is Plato's idea that this person who has been freed and who has had their eyes adjust, who has spent time outside the cave, who has come to understand all these forms and has come to understand the form of the good, they will come back into the cave. And what Plato says is that they'll be forced to come back into the cave. They'll be forced by us. Who is us? Well, with Socrates and Glaucon. What do you mean forced by us? In the Republic, Socrates and Glaucon are trying to paint a picture of the ideal city. And so they're imagining themselves as the founders of a city, of a state. And so what he's saying here is, what we need to do is us as the founders of the city, of the state, what we need to do is we need to force these people who have this full understanding to go back into the cave, so to speak, go back into society and become the leaders, the rulers, the politicians of society, of that. And that's represented by having them come back down into the cave to be among their fellow humans and to be their leaders and rulers. This is one of the most remarked upon features of the cave. We're actually not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, other than basically what I've said. Now, what Plato indicates is that when this prisoner first comes back in, or when this freed prisoner who's seen the sun first comes back in, his eyes will have to adjust, right? He's going from extreme brightness to the bottom of a cave. He's not going to be able to see things very well. And so when these shadows are going back and forth on the wall of the cave, he won't be able to make them out very well. And so the other prisoners are going to think that this person who ascended out of the cave and came back, they're going to think that his eyes were ruined, that he was ruined by taking this trip out of the cave. Because look, he can't see anything now. And so these prisoners, the people who have never gone out of the cave, they're going to have a very negative attitude about ascending out of the cave. They're going to have a very negative attitude toward the person who frees prisoners. And what Plato says is they're probably going to want to execute that guy who goes around freeing prisoners. That guy's ruining people. He's corrupting people. We should take that guy out. We'll return to that guy in just a second. But eventually, Plato says, this prisoner, this guy who has ascended and come back in, his eyes will adjust over time. and he will be able to make out these shadows better than anybody. And he'll know exactly what's going on. And so he'll be able to kind of handle these things better than the prisoners themselves will. And so he'll be a good ruler and blah, 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 and so on. Okay. Two details that Plato doesn't pin down for us, but you can kind of hazard a guess. One question that students oftentimes have: who is this person? Who are these people who are, walking back and forth with these plastic trees, with these fake things, these statues or artifacts, as Plato calls them? Who is that? Well, if we pay attention to the fact that Plato's illustration is not trees, but Plato's idea is that somehow justice could be run through this whole story, right? What we have then, who this person with these statues is, who that's got to be, is somebody who is projecting these false views of justice, these images of justice. Well, having read the Gorgias, this phrase, image of justice, should ring a bell. Who projects an image of justice? Rhetoricians obviously do. That's part of Socrates' conception of rhetoric in the Gorgias. And so one guess as to who those people are carrying these statues and artifacts back and forth: rhetoricians. They are the people projecting these false views of justice to everybody. And so it's Gorgias back behind that wall. I wouldn't, so does that mean Gorgias has been freed? Does that mean Gorgias sees more of the truth about things? I wouldn't read that into it. I think the analogy might break down at that point. I think Plato, at the end of the day, would probably want to say that Gorgias is just as enchained as these other people, but that doesn't really quite fit with the image. But the main point would be that Gorgias is projecting these images of justice. And there's reason to think that it's not just Gorgias that Plato would have in mind, or rhetoricians that Plato would have in mind here, but also poets. We haven't looked at this at all, but Plato is in certain places very critical of poets and poetry. People like Homer, and so he might have poets in mind here too, because he thinks they're giving a kind of faulty education. They're giving a kind of faulty moral education, providing these false ideas about what justice and the virtues and happiness look like. He thinks poets do this. He thinks Homer does this. So someone like Gorgias, right, is misleading people. And that's part of the reason why it's so important for Socrates to embarrass Gorgias, to embarrass these rhetoricians, because Gorgias is fundamentally and systematically misleading people about the most important things, about what happiness consists in, about justice, and so on. Return then to this mysterious figure who frees people. This person is trying to correct people's false ideas about justice, trying to direct them towards the truth about justice. And for that work, for those efforts, what's this mysterious figure rewarded with? Execution. The other prisoners are going to want to kill him. The other prisoners are going to think that he's corrupting people. And so if it isn't obvious by now, it's fairly clear that Plato has in mind Socrates here. Socrates is this person who goes around freeing people and directing them towards the truth. He frees people with these arguments. He directs them towards the truth with his arguments, with his refutations of their views. And what we saw is that when he first frees prisoners, it's going to be very painful. And they're not going to want to hear it. They're not going to want to do it. They're going to want to just go back and sit down, just like Callicles and Polus, right? When you're shown that your beliefs about justice are wrong, and Socrates did that to Polus, did that to Callicles, justice and happiness and so on. When you're shown that you're wrong, your initial reaction, that's painful. You don't like it. It makes you angry. It makes you embarrassed. It's painful. And you're, in all likelihood, just going to go back to what you were doing. That's exactly what Callicles and Polus do, right? And Callicles makes a point of it. You're just going to go back and sit down and look at those shadows on the wall of the cave. Yeah. And so undergoing this process from Socrates, this being refuted, having your views shown to be false, yes, it's very painful. People don't like it. And so that's why they kind of come at him. That's another reason why, right? And so now we kind of have we can see how Socrates is functioning in Plato's views, right? He frees these people and directs them toward the truth. Now, this is all supposed to be an image of our education. I want to talk explicitly about what that means. I mean, it's kind of clear from what we've been saying, but let's turn to it explicitly now. Socrates directly states that education is not a matter of putting knowledge into souls. And this might seem a bit odd. If you think about what it is you're doing at Loyola when you're learning things, being educated, one, what's going on? What is it to undergo an education like this? One very natural thing to think is that, well, I go to whatever, I don't know. I go to my computer science class or my biology class or whatever, and they teach me about, in computer science, they teach me about, I don't know what they teach you about, coding. I don't know what's going on in computer science, right? They teach me how to code a thing so I can make little games on my phone or whatever. And then I go to biology and they teach me how frogs work. And so now I have these facts in my head. I know that how frogs work. They taught me in biology, right? I had to cut one open and whatever, see its lungs or whatever. Yeah. And so I know about all that stuff. And so you might think to be educated or getting an education is simply a matter of learning stuff, putting knowledge into your soul would be the way Socrates would put that point. It's just learning facts and having them there now. And now I know more things. Socrates is, and then same thing with philosophy, right? You go to your philosophy class and you learn that Plato thought there were forms, and now I got that fact and it's in my, okay, great, got it, right? I'm getting knowledge. I'm educated now. Socrates is saying that's not what education is. That's not really what it is to be educated. Shove all the facts you like into somebody. That doesn't make them educated. It's not a matter of simply putting knowledge into souls. Education, rather, is a turning of the soul, a turning of the soul away from what is least true, most false, and toward the truth. Education is a turning of the soul toward the truth. And so what he has in mind, right? You have someone like a prisoner. That's all of us. That's these uneducated people. We're all uneducated. We're looking at these shadows of fake things. To be educated is to have your chains broken and to be turned around, to have your soul's gaze directed away from these shadows and towards the truth. It's fundamentally a matter of one's kind of orientation. And being directed toward the truth, That's what it is to be a philosopher. That's what philosophy is. And so Socrates and Plato are using philosophy in a much broader sense than we would today, right? Philosophy today is like, well, it's these classes you take. You take classes on whatever, on persons, philosophy in persons. You take whatever. Plato's using philosophy or thinks of philosophy in much broader terms. Philosophy is fundamentally a kind of matter of what you most desire. And what he picks up on in other dialogues more directly is the etymology of the word philosophy, philosophia. That's two Greek words, philo and sophia. Philosophy itself is derived from a Greek word, right? Its etymology is Greek. Philosophia. Philo means something like love of, or really it means something more like friend, but love of. And Sophia is wisdom. Philosophy is simply the love of wisdom. And wisdom is simply truth, having the truth. Philosophy is really just the love of truth. It's being directed toward the truth, taking truth to be the most valuable thing, not honor or money or pleasure. Turning away from those things, right? What is so what this idea of turning your soul, what does that mean? Turning your soul away from these shadows and towards the truth. I take it what Plato has in mind here is something like the following. What is it to have your soul turn toward the truth? It's to, what is it that ultimately is guiding you? What do you take to be most valuable and important? Is it money? Is it prestige or respect? Or is it the truth? And Plato is saying to live rightly and to live well, you need to take truth as the most important value. How do you know what you're directed toward? Well, that's hard. That requires self knowledge. But I think one thing Plato could say, or Socrates could say, is well, look at the choices you make, look at how you're living your life. The decisions, the big decisions, getting up and getting, some yogurt or whatever, that's not the kind of decision you look at, but looking at like the big decisions that you make that are determining the direction of your life, like going to college for 4 years and spending $250,000 on it and whatever, right? Why are you doing that? Look at the big decisions people make, or look at the big decisions you yourself are making, and try to see what that's for. Is it really just for comfort or pleasure or doing what you want or money? Well, if so, that's what your soul is turned toward. But if your big decisions in life are really in some way or another directed towards truth, towards things that are, towards reality, towards what's real, towards the truth about things, well, then that's the mark of being educated. That's what it is to be educated. It's to have this desire for truth, to place truth above those other things. What's more important than getting a good job is pursuing the truth, the ultimate, most important truths about things, and understanding the ultimate, most important truths about reality and the cosmos and human beings. That's more important than prestige or money or pleasure or any of these other things. That's what Plato is saying. Now, what else? And then the idea is at some point, yeah, you have a teacher, sure, fine. You need someone like Socrates, a teacher in this context, right? Socrates is a kind of teacher. You need someone to direct you in that way, but eventually, hopefully, you'll do it on your own and you'll desire the truth just for its own sake. Right? And so being educated is not a matter of mastering physics or calculus or whatever. It's a matter of what the fundamental orientation of your life is. What makes people educated is simply that they are directed toward the truth. Now, one of the things that Plato thinks, and what he would stress here, is that it's fundamentally a matter of direction. It's not necessarily a matter of fully grasping it. One curious feature of the image of the cave is that it culminates, right? The ascent culminates with staring at the sun. I don't know how many of you have tried staring at the sun, but I don't recommend it. You will go blind. It's beyond your eyes' abilities. Your eyes can't handle it. In the same way, I think that's deliberate, that's woven into the image. And so, in the same way, what Plato seems to be indicating is that we can't fully understand the form of the good. Full understanding of reality and truth is beyond our mind's abilities. We can't stare at the sun. We can't fully comprehend the form of the good. Nonetheless, our souls need to be directed towards it. And what it is to live well is to be directed towards it, right? To be directed towards the fundamental truth of all things, even if that truth escapes our abilities, even if we can't fully comprehend the fundamental truths of things. This idea ends up being hugely influential going forward. And in particular, ends up being hugely influential on the major Western religious traditions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Plato himself ends up being hugely influential on them, but this idea in particular, because according to them, the form of the good, and according to Plato, the form of the good is divine. And so, what these religious thinkers have in mind, taking Plato on board, is like, well, really, the stand-in form of the good is going to be something like God. God is ultimate goodness, and God is the ultimate explanation, the ultimate truth of things. And understanding God, and these major religious traditions, all these major religious traditions want to say something like this, right? That's beyond our ability. We cannot fully comprehend or understand God. And so people like Moses Maimonides and Avicenna and Thomas Aquinas, right? Moses Maimonides is a Jewish theologian, Avicenna is an Islamic theologian, and Thomas Aquinas is a Christian theologian. They all saw that idea here in Plato. Yeah. Nonetheless, what it is to live a good life, what we really want is to be directed in that way, right? They would all say something like that. Last thing that I want to mention now, how does any of this relate to like virtue and justice? Well, recall that instead of trees, Plato's kind of hinted at illustration would be justice. And so this person who has ascended out of the cave, they would see the form of justice. They would comprehend the true essence of justice. And Plato is not as clear that that's impossible. That might very well be possible for us, right? You can look at trees. That doesn't burn your eyes, right? It's only looking at the sun that kind of burns your eyes. It's only full, total, complete understanding that's impossible for us. But perhaps we can come to really know and understand justice. Well, in light of what the Gorgias had said, right? If you know justice, then you will be just. It's these people who understand the form of justice who will be fully and truly virtuous, who will be fully and truly just, right? So, really, to acquire these virtues, you need to fully acquire them, to truly and fully be just, and not, well, we don't need to get into details here, but to be fully just, you're going to need to be directed towards the truth about justice, and you need to grasp it. And so that's fundamentally going to be a matter of being directed towards the fundamental truth of things, the ultimate truth of things. And so virtue, real, true, complete, full virtue, also requires education, requires this ascent out of the cave. And so it's really only these people who have ascended, who see the truth about things, who are directed towards the truth of things, who live happy lives, who live good lives, right? And so philosophy for Plato is essential to happiness, is essential to a life well lived. And people like Callicles and Polus, who belittle philosophy, they're just mucking around with these shadows. They're like these ignorant prisoners chained up, bickering over shadows on the wall, right? That's the view that Plato has. And it's really philosophy that kind of sets us free from these kind of narrow, culturally determined, societally determined views about what a good life looks like, about what justice looks like, right? It's philosophy that sets you free to genuinely know the truth and genuinely pursue true virtue.